To recap how to analyze causation in a homicide, remember we're going to do 2 steps. Step 1, we're going to determine the factual causes. For that, I want you to use the but-for test to find possible factual causes. You might find 2 causes. Once you've determined the factual causes, step 2 kicks in. That's when we're going to determine from those 2 causes which one should be the proximate cause or the legal cause. When more than one cause exists, analyze the intervening act. That's our direct cause, to see if it's reasonably foreseeable. If it is reasonably foreseeable, defendant should be on the hook. Defendant should be responsible. What will cut the chain of causation for our purposes are the 6 we talked about. If defendant's act is diminished behavior, the intended consequences doctrine, whether the victim or third party's intervening act was an omission, whether that act was actually foreseeable or not, the apparent safety doctrine, and voluntary human intervention by the victim. Now that we've got the concepts at play, I want to take a few more examples to play out the analysis. Here's the first one. Defendant shoots the victim who goes to the hospital. At the hospital, victim contracts a staph infection and dies. Is defendant still responsible for victim's death? Using our steps of analysis, we would employ first the but-for test to determine all of our factual causes. But for defendant's shooting the victim wouldn't have been in the hospital to be exposed to a staph infection and die. Factual cause number 2 is the staph infection at the hospital. So I've got 2 factual causes. Victim wouldn't have died but for defendant having shot him, and he wouldn't have died but for the staph infection. Let me do the legal terminology. Defendant is the indirect cause of victim's death because he's further away in the movie from when victim dies. And we've got an intervening act, which is the direct cause. That's the staph infection. Should he remain liable? If we think the intervening act of the staph infection is foreseeable, he's still liable. If we think the intervening act is unforeseeable or any of the other doctrines are at play, it cuts off the liability. In this case, we would say that the intervening act of acquiring an infection in the hospital is reasonably foreseeable. Defendant should have been able to foresee that that could happen. Defendant assumes that risk when he shoots the victim. The burden is on him. He set that in motion when he caused the victim to be in the hospital from the shooting. Okay, same shooting, but now example number 2, let's swap out the intervening act. Instead of a staph infection, let's assume it's a negligent doctor. That's the intervening act. 2 factual causes. Defendant shooting the victim and our negligent doctor hastening the death. Which of the 2 causes should be responsible for victim's death? Defendant who shot him or negligent doctor? Let's employ the same analysis as we did before. We've got 2 factual causes. Now I'm going to focus on the intervening act. Do you think the intervening act of a negligent doctor is reasonably foreseeable so that defendant should be liable? Or do you think it's unforeseeable so it cuts the chain of causation and relieves defendant of liability? Maybe you're going to be surprised by this answer, but we're going to say that the negligent doctor, that intervening act, is actually a foreseeable part of medical life. We don't like it. We sue if there is negligence, but it's not unforeseeable that that could happen. It's not exemplary and it's civilly actionable, but the negligent doctor is a risk that the defendant should have assumed when he shot the victim. As a basic policy, this makes sense. Our shooter's a bad actor, and between the bad actor shooter and our negligent doctor, the criminal law is going to want to punish our bad actor, the shooter. So what might cut off defendant's liability? What might cut the chain of causation in this example? Let's swap out the intervening act. What if our doctor now isn't just negligent, but our doctor is drunk when he operates on the victim or tends to the victim? Now we have an intervening act that the law is not prepared to call foreseeable. This intervening act is unforeseeable and is going to cut the chain of causation and relieve defendant of liability. That makes sense. Between defendant shooter and drunk doctor, we're going to want to send a message that says we don't tolerate the drunk medical professionals operating on patients. So between shooter and drunk doctor, the law is going to hold the drunk doctor liable and not the shooter for the criminal homicide. But remember, that doesn't mean our shooter's off the hook. Our shooter's still going to be responsible for having shot the victim, just not for the homicide of the victim.